You were so generous last time, Jack. I felt like almost guilty towards the end of it. This poor guy is just letting me barrage him with questions.
No, but it's a mutual. I mean, we get to talking, and you're listening. You're letting me rattle on, so it's not your fault. I'm I take advantage of the opportunity, Ryan.
I was re-listening to our interview on the plane yesterday because, that was episode 19 of this show, Jack. We're almost at 200 now. So you had come to my life and I felt like this deep sense of I do not deserve to have such a, magnificent author to give me so much time. And I was feeling guilty beyond the hour mark thinking, come on, this guy's got better things to do than
Come
talk
on.
to me. But it was amazing because listening back to it, it was actually so much on Mongolia and this incredible new chapter that you just forged for yourself after 50. The Berlin Wall falls, you fly over to the former Soviet bloc, and then, this is like an entire new life that you've been able to carve out post 50, which I just think is so
Yeah, yeah.
cool and unique. Like, where else do you see that?
Well, I don't think. Well, tomorrow I turn 78, so I'm ready for a new life. Oh God.
Is there another twist on the horizon for you, Jack?
You know, this is my last book on Mongolia. And I've been living in Cambodia for a while, and I always feel an obligation to the people who take me in, as a refugee or whatever. And I've been working for a few years on this thing in my head mostly, but also now I'm writing out. Uh, Cambodia needs a good history, not just the killing fields and all. And so I thought I've chosen kind of the first Buddhist king of Cambodia, unknown to the world, no biography outside of Cambodia, but he's a very interesting person. And I think he has a lot of lessons for the modern world. And I would love to see a book do well in the world that doesn't have to do with genocide.
Mm-hmm.
That's about all we know about Cambodia's genocide. And it was
Yeah.
horrible, horrific beyond words for 4 years. But it's a great civilization, a great country, and they deserve something good. And I think their Buddhist king, because he created a universal healthcare system for the Khmer Empire, free hospitals, free medication, trained doctors. He built 102 hospitals. I mean, it was something unheard of in the world, and it was about the same time as Genghis Khan. So for me,
How
it's
about that?
an era I know. I was going to say I came to it actually by way of the first Mongol ambassador. That's when I came to Cambodia, following him and what he did. He came here and he stayed a year, or there to Cambodia, and he stayed 1 year in the Angkor Empire, and that got me started on it. And then I thought, wow, there's interesting story here.
Because there was a big and thriving civilization before the 1200s, which would be the timeline that this first Buddhist king that you've just described.
Yes, he was really near the end.
Have historians really uncovered the great ancient history of Cambodia in that region?
Not so much, we had the French scholars who were here. They did, of course, a lot of work, but they had their own interests that were a little bit different from mine.
Mm.
And generally, they were not interested in Buddhism. And this was the greatest king in Cambodian history, and he did an incredible job with building roads, bridges, rest centers, and then hospitals. But he had also been a conqueror for the first half of his life. And it was his second wife. His first wife died, and he married her older sister, who was actually we would say a professor teaching women at that
Mm-hmm.
time about theology and philosophy. And he married the older sister after his wife died, and she led him in a new direction.
And you're an anthropologist by trade, right, Jack?
Yeah, by trade, yes. But you just drift around, whatever.
But there is such rich narrative to the books that you write, and like they read as almost narrative nonfiction rather than anthropological texts. Is that really intentional by you?
You know, it's sort of odd, but Yes and no. I'm not sure of the answer. When I was struggling around as a young graduate student and doing the dissertation and what came after, then you're learning a certain style. And fortunately, I had also been trained in Germany, so I could make sentences that were enormously long with lots of clauses, and that got me really through graduate school. But I was playing around with how do I make these ideas, and my wife, she said, okay, you're just talking to me, but you're on the radio and I'm in another place and you're talking to me on the radio and I can't see anything except what you tell me. And wow, it's just amazing that something that simple could say, wow, that's a whole different way to think about it. I'm not talking about just scholars at a conference who are looking for me to make a mistake about 1269 versus 79. We got him. No, it's just, but also history is the story of people's lives. And you can make great principles, great movements of history, class struggles, and religious and civilization struggles. But every one of those at the heart is still a person who has an emotion. They're doing something for a reason. Other people are doing something for a reason. They have an emotion, maybe the same or conflicting or what. It's the story. And that's what interests me. And any of these abstract principles, they come out of the actions of individual people.
I read on one of the reviews of Emperor of the Seas that Weatherford continues his decades-long quest to rescue the Mongols from their reputation as uncivilized marauders.
Well, I like that in a certain way. I mean, I do think that is their reputation, and I do think it's much more. However, that's only a selective representation of that representation. Because I think, as you and I think, have talked about in the past, people such as Geoffrey Chaucer greatly respected Genghis Khan, the Mongols. We had many great people who did, and I'm following in that line. Now, the majority did not, especially if the Mongols conquered you. For the most part, you did not like them. People don't like their conquerors. No. And that's all understandable. But also the Mongols themselves perpetuated these horrible stereotypes. It was a part of their war propaganda, and so they would send out refugees who said, they killed 6 million people in that city. Well, there was no city in the world with even 1 million at that time. But nevertheless, the Mongols let it go out, and then scribes eagerly recorded that, it's a number, let's put that down. And so the Mongols are partially responsible for their own horrible reputation. But also it's a part of a larger bias against nomadic people. All tribal people have been sort of characterized by that, whether it's the Germans attacking the great civilization of Rome, or the Moors attacking Europe, all these different groups. And I reject a lot of that. I reject most of it, not just in the case of Mongols, but in many of the cases of our tribal people.
A broad characterization of if people live in tents and just of subsistence animal herding, then they must be uncivilized and savage.
Yes.
And maybe a little bit less than the more civilized people that live in apartment buildings.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, that's the bias that runs all the way through history. But then there's always a counter stream. Even with the Romans, we have Tacitus. Tacitus wrote about the Germans with tremendous respect, these barbarian tribes. He realized there was more to them than barbarian tribes. We also had Ibn Khaldun among the Arabs. He also was one of the great defenders of tribal people as being the revitalizing force over and over of civilizations. The civilizations tended to ripen and decay. And then tribal people would come in, they would conquer, and they would revitalize those civilizations. So there has been this counter narrative, but it's mostly ignored. I mean, people, how many read Ibn Khaldun or read Tacitus or something? It's not, but it's great exciting to have a great TV epic or a streaming epic about barbarians and fighting and swords and gladiators and all these kind of things.
And in the Western understanding, or at least the Western propaganda. It was really propagated first by Voltaire, right? Because he wanted to characterize the politicians of his day in a negative light, but couldn't directly call them out. So rather, they were tagged as Mongols. And it all kind of goes downstream from there.
Yes, he really changed the narrative that had developed in France. It was very positive to the Mongols. We had a very great scholar, diplomat scholar named Petit de la Croix, who did the first biography of Genghis Khan, and he called him Genghis Khan the Great. Very simple. That was a book that was very popular in the American colonies, especially with Thomas Jefferson. He bought so many copies and gave them out. But so for some reason, Voltaire then seized on Genghis Khan as a way to criticize the king of France without risking his own life by saying what he meant. So he wrote this play about him that was really sort of a ripoff of a Yuan dynasty play, which was The Orphan of China. And that began to change it. The other thing I think, Ryan, was soon after that, the rise of Napoleon. He gave a very sort of a newly invigorated negative view of conquerors in general. And so I can see even in the writing of Thomas Jefferson as his life went on after he faced that Napoleonic era, he decreased the amount of praise he had had earlier in life for Genghis Khan and he began to be more suspicious. Also, I think at that time, the Americans were feeling a little bit of threat from American Indians out west. And so that was all the more reason not to talk about these tribes too much. And in fact, Jefferson believed that the Native American Indians, were related to the Mongols, that they had come over from Asia.
Is there any anthropological proof of that? Or is that rather just a
there's
characterization?
DNA.
Great horse
There's DNA evidence of North Siberian connections with Native American people through tens of thousands of years of people moving back and forth. But to specify it as the Mongols is much, much too specific and much too late in history. No, but of course, eventually DNA connects us all. But the Bering Strait was no barrier to the movement of people back and forth.
But it's fascinating how these negative, whether intentional or not, propagandistic terms of phrase can carry down. Because I even remember when I was growing up, if someone was deformed or something, it'd be very derogatory, but it'd be a Mongoloid. It would be etymologically downstream of this same word, Mongolian or Mongol.
Yes.
And so you can just see how it persists and persists. So I guess there is truth to the idea that you are on this decades-long quest to just rewrite and rechange association.
But, it's sadly, something like calling these children Mongoloids, that didn't come out of ignorant folk wisdom. That came from scientists. The scientists in Europe had decided that, the Europeans are obviously a superior race. I mean, they're superior to Asians, they're superior to Africans, they're the superior race. So how can we have these children who are retarded, they're not as smart as everybody? How can that happen to the superior race? And their solution was, they're not really white children. They are descended from Mongol rape victims. This was a scientific theory, and it's horrific. And so therefore we don't call them white children, we call them Mongoloids.
Yeah.
Just absolutely horrific. And it came from science, not from the ignorant people at the bottom. It came from scientists.
But it does feel like, I don't know if you're swimming in the same corners of the internet as me, Jack, but the attitude towards Genghis and the Mongolian Empire, all the way down to Kublai, which you've just written about, is changing. It's more spoken of with reverence now and appreciation and respect, and maybe a little bit more understanding of the time period within which it happened. Obviously, these are thousands of men on horseback going to take over, people who didn't necessarily deserve it, who just live in their lives. So there is something quite bad about that, but it's also, it's all couched in the time of that's how an ambitious person would be able to express themselves in one way or another.
Yes, warfare is horrific at any time, any era, any culture, any place. And if we're talking about today, the wars that go on in the world, they are horrific. They killed children, they killed other innocent people, women, elderly, young men who are soldiers, young women who are fighting for their country, everyone. The United States alone dropping atomic bombs on civilian targets of cities. We don't think about that. We just somehow, quest for freedom, democracy, fighting against fascism, and I don't know. We have all these vague ideas like that. But it's true in every single war, and I'm not condemning the United States for doing that. That was a tactical decision that they made. Whether good or bad, that's a different subject. But the Mongols also, they killed people in war. There is no denying that. But they also accomplished great things. And sometimes in our history, we only want to talk about what we accomplished, not about really too much slavery or genocide or dropping atomic bombs or invading countries all over the world. No, we don't want to talk about that. It's just we couch all of that in terms of sort of theoretical ideas of doing good in the world. And even if it goes wrong, we were trying to do good in Vietnam. And all. These are lies. These are just pure, outright lies. And we can't see that in ourselves. But then we see other people, we tend to minimize their accomplishments and maximize the barbarity of what they were doing. And I'm not trying to deny the barbarity of any group of humans, including us today. I don't deny that, but I wanted to look at a different side of the history. In a certain way, I feel like it helps to lift us up if we can see in other people ideas that we may share in part, but not wholly. I think it helps us to understand the world better and in our own lives, in our own situation better.
Yeah, because it is this expression of an attempt at power and groups of ambitious people that has shaped the current landscape that we inhabit. My own country, Australia, was invaded by English people, and it was really horrible, obviously, to the Indigenous people that lived there. But now I'm here as a proud Australian. It is obviously an ongoing discussion, which probably doesn't even have a conclusion or right answer.
I think none of us should bear the sins of the past. Those are not our sins, unless we continue to commit them. It's good to help us understand either our privileged position in society or victimization in society. But what happened before us is not our fault. But what happens today is our responsibility. And so I think that we need to be aware of it. Yes, you can be a proud Australian today and still be very aware of the tragedy of the history. You can be a proud American today and be very well aware of the horrors of American history. And still, that happened then. Now we're trying to change it. Now we don't want that. Now we want something else. And I think that's true everywhere in the world.
So you're in Southeast Asia at the moment, Thailand. You mentioned at the very beginning this transition to a new book about the first Buddhist Cambodian king. I was really, really shocked to see that Kublai had made it all the way down to Vietnam and Indonesia. These Mongols on horseback in thick, dense forest on the other side of men on elephants. Like, it was quite a dramatic scene.
Yes. Kublai Khan was really following the old Mongol system of conquering by land. And so you send the army farther and farther and farther. The problem for the Mongolian army was that pretty much under Genghis Khan, they had reached kind of all the areas that you could really reach easily on land by horses. And then you start hitting rivers that are too big to cross, or they don't freeze up in the winter. You cannot walk across them in the ice, or you started hitting jungles, humid areas. So Kublai Khan really had a problem. He was thinking in the old Mongol way of you send in the cavalry. That's all the Mongols had, basically. You send in the cavalry, and you go, but when you hit Vietnam, it's jungle country and has some large rivers, and it's a whole different ball game. And the people attacking you or fighting against you are not arriving on horseback; they're on elephants. So the the first efforts, actually all the efforts are going to prove unsuccessful in Vietnam, but the first efforts in 1258, when he sent down just a very good general named Kublai, who was the son of the greatest general of Genghis Khan's time, Subadai. He was his son, and they had conquered Yunnan, the province now part of China. At that time, it was not. They had conquered that, and then they just came on down very nearby to the Red River of northern Vietnam. And so Kublai and his son Aju were coming down the river, and they were in totally unknown territory. It was very difficult because the horses did not have food. They didn't have fodder. There just wasn't enough grass. There was jungle, but the horses can't eat the jungle. And then there are all these rice fields with stubble, but the rice straw is not very healthy for a horse or for any animal, really. So they had a great problem. They got down the river, and the Dai Viet king or emperor, whichever you call him, different people want to call him with a different title. He had come up the river on boats, and they had brought elephants with them, and they were on one side of the river, Urihankadai and Aju and those were on the other side of the river. And the Mongols had to come up with a plan. But by this time, Mongols had also fought elephants in Burma and a few other places, so they knew the key is take flaming arrows and shoot it at the feet. If you hit the feet of the elephants, they will panic and run.
Yeah.
Okay, they had that part of the plan, but they were thinking about what to do about the boats, and they had the clear plan. They understood the importance of the boats, kinda. They said, okay, we're going to send one contingent to attack the elephants. We're going to send one contingent to burn the boats so the people can't escape. There's jungle around them. They can't escape. Well, Mongols just don't understand. The soldiers just don't quite get it about go attack a boat. It's an empty boat. What? Now, I want to attack the elephant. I want to attack the elephant. So they all rushed off to attack the elephant. They ignored the boats. They succeeded. The elephants panicked, ran, but the soldier and the entire court loaded onto their boats and sailed away. The Mongols could say they won the battle in a way. They were standing there still and the enemy was gone. And this happened over and over in Vietnam. And they failed by land, and then later they tried by sea. And they also failed by sea. So they failed, and it was a series of invasions that went over nearly 30 years under the reign of Kublai Khan, and they never succeeded in conquering Vietnam, but they sure tried.
That battle that you just described in the book, what stood out to me was the sort of pride of the Mongol warriors to almost find it as a improper way to almost fight the battle, to not actually take on the warriors themselves, but burn the boats, which they failed to do because they did in the reverse. But historically, if we look back to Genghis Khan of the making of the modern world, like the Mongols weren't above doing these, very sort of trickster moves. Famously, they would do the false flee, pretend to be running away just to ambush the bunch of people. So why is it that, 50 years after Genghis has died and Kublai's managing this army, the Mongols are fighting with this type of pride rather than the tactical nous that they might have had otherwise?
I think their tactics work perfectly on wide open plains, the steppe, where you could have this fake flight. You run away, you lure the enemy out, they get spread out, and then you turn around, you go back, and you destroy them. It doesn't work in a jungle environment. It's just a whole different world. And also the idea that a boat could be important was very difficult for the early Mongols to comprehend. They crossed the river or the men would cross the river on inflated goat skins. That was because it's a very deeply rooted thing in the Mongolian culture. On the land, men ride a horse. Women have carts. They have carts that are usually pulled by oxen or sometimes by camel. All carts belong to women. The men would just never ride in a cart unless they're totally unconscious and being taken somewhere. And even then, they'd rather be thrown across their horse to be taken. If they had to guide a cart, they would simply guided by the reins staying on their horse, or if necessary, they'd get off and walk before they would sit on a cart. A cart is a wooden thing. It's not a living thing. And they see a boat, and it's kind of like a cart on the water. So it doesn't strike them as a weapon, as anything dangerous. And why am I going to go and attack the boat? It really took a while for them to change. But the defeat, the victory of Orihanggadai in the battle, but his defeat in Vietnam, and he had to flee. His son Aju, he learned those lessons. And Aju became the one who really led the military transformation under Kublai Khan to understand that a boat could also be a weapon. Once the Mongols had it that the boat can be a weapon, they were pretty much okay. Then they got to move. But anything that moved for the Mongols could be a weapon. Anything that didn't move could be a target.
Throughout the book, there's a series of proverbs, Mongolian proverbs, and what really stands out is just their deep, irrational fear of water. Maybe not irrational, but nonetheless fear of water. And it was even comparing deep water to being as dangerous as flames or field of flames.
Dude.
So, yeah. So how did Kublai sort of transition the Mongolian forces into opening up to the idea of putting their horses on these wooden ships and going across the seas?
Southern China was controlled when Kublai Khan was ruling northern China. Southern China was controlled by the Southern Song, the old Song dynasty. And they had a navy, a defensive navy. And they called this the Great Wall of the Sea. This is before the Great Wall of the Ming Dynasty was built, but they had a Great Wall of the Sea. But in this Southern Southern Song mentality, they saw it as a wall. So they would put ships side by side, chain them together, and they would make a wall underwater to keep out the Mongols. So then the Mongols had already been dealing a little bit with walls up north, about fortified cities, and they had learned how to conquer them. The first efforts from Genghis Khan actually to bring down a wall were very difficult because he saw the walls and he knew that their men couldn't scale. You can't go over the wall on a horse. If you can't do that on a horse, the Mongol doesn't quite know what to do. But he looked all around and he saw these canals and how they had diverted rivers and everything. So he diverted part of the Yellow River to attack the walls of the city. The first time he did it, it was not successful because he flooded his own camp. The levees, the embankments broke and flooded his camp. But he did it again correctly, and he succeeded. So they had learned how to break down the walls on land, and then they had to learn how to do it on sea. And one of the important things was with Aju, when he was besieging some of the cities of China, of southern China, along the Yangtze River. He studied them very carefully. He would go out day and night on the rivers, the creeks, looking at the cities and examine. And he realized that on the land side, they had massive walls because they always expected a land invasion. The army would come by land, attack their wall. On the water side, they also had a wall, but it wasn't so strong. It was just there, just kind of keep people out because they never expected an attack from the water. So he knew, okay, he had to attack from the water. How would he do that with the boats? And he thought about their land equipment, and they were using catapults, trebuchets, but they were not strong enough. And so they sent off to what's now Iran, the Ilkhanate back then, which was being ruled by Kublai Khan's nephew at this time. And they ordered engineers to come in from Iran to build new types of trebuchets or catapults that could be mounted on a ship, and they could be fired at the wall without sinking the ship. It took a while to do this. It was a very complex thing, but they perfected it. They did it. And then they hit those walls, and then the defenders of the cities had no ability to repair the walls fast enough. So they broke down the walls on the weakest point. So they began in this way to transform into a really offensive navy. At first, it was a riverine navy, just, along the Yangtze River and the tributaries. But then they had to go down the coast, and they kept getting farther and farther out into the water. Their first big trial, to try to conquer a place by water was against Japan, with their attempted invasion of Japan, and it failed. But they learned a lot by doing it, and with the invasion of Japan, usually they treated it as though, well, he wanted to conquer Japan and rule it. I think that's probably true in the sense he wanted them to swear allegiance to him, but mostly he wanted to cut off their trade with the Southern Song. The sulfur sources of China were located at that time in the north, and so the Mongols had them for making gunpowder. The Southern Song was cut off from their supply of materials, but they were getting it from Japan. So if he could cut that trade, and so he did, even though they failed to conquer Japan, they cut the trade. And so it's sort of half successful, depending on how you look at it.
Nice. We're definitely going to get to Japan, Jack, but I just want to sort of set up this question because I realize about 30 minutes in, we haven't maybe introduced properly who Kublai is and the main context for what he's entering into. So Genghis Khan, who no one needs an introduction to, is Kublai's grandfather, hereditary grandfather. Oh, wait, is there any other type of grandfather? Okay.
Yeah.
And Genghis had conquered the Great Eurasian Steppe, and at the time of his death had conquered more territory than any other person who had lived. But the Khan Empire continued to expand, and the great agricultural fields in south of China, this Song dynasty, was something Genghis could never achieve. And then he has a son and a grandson, both who are fierce, great leaders, great warriors. But it's this less warrior, more cerebral, sickly kind of Kublai Khan who ends up being the successor that does expand the territories. So with that as sort of the context, could you explain, where he comes into the story, how he himself amassed the power and resources and following to ultimately conquer the Song dynasty, which his grandfather never could?
Well, I think you've explained it very well. You summarized it. And if you looked at Kublai Khan, when he was born by coincidence in the very same year that his grandfather, Genghis Khan, conquered Beijing, 1215. He was born about 3 months later. But he was the second son of Genghis Khan's fourth son. So there were lots of older cousins who were already out there fighting battles, and they were very good at war. He already had an older brother who was very popular. He was already charismatic. He was at the court of, after Genghis Khan, he grew up in the court of his uncle Agute Khan, who was the great Khan of the empire. He was sophisticated in the Mongol way. He knew everybody of any importance. And then Kublai Khan, for some reason, his mother recognized that he just wasn't the best of Mongols. Well, I should say Genghis Khan had recognized it because he said that about him. That's the only comment we have. He said, "You don't look like a Mongol." Which means kind of, he said, "You look like your mother's people group." She was more Turkic, actually, than anything but Sorokhtani. But I don't know if that caused him to have a different life trajectory or what, that one comment. But she was educating him with a lot of tutors, Chinese tutors, but also different religious tutors. She herself was a Christian woman. His mother was Christian. But he had a nurse for him who was a Tangut Buddhist. And so he grew up in this very mixed atmosphere, and he was doing very well. He was becoming the more educated. Well, he really didn't seem to be in line to ever become anybody. His older brothers were all doing better. I mean, older cousins were all doing better. They were conquering Europe and looting Russia and Ukraine and dashing through Iran and all these places. And he was back home looking at Buddhist philosophy and Christian ideas and this kind of stuff. And also he was overweight. He could ride a horse. All Mongols could ride a horse, but he's not the most graceful of all. So really didn't seem like he was destined for much. But his mother was a mastermind politician, and she had maneuvered his eldest brother, Munk, who became then Munk Han, into the position of the great Han of the Mongol Empire. And she herself was ruling northern China at that point as the regent for her deceased husband. And so I think her idea was train Kublai Khan, to become a good administrator for China. I think that was her plan. And she was doing a very good job with no idea that soon after she died, Mong Han himself died in 1259. And so when he died, all of a sudden it was very unclear who would take over. And his youngest brother, so Kublai Khan's younger brother, Arik Buk, he was back in Mongolia. He was real Mongol. He was a hothead. At one time, he had been put in charge of administering the religious affairs. And so he had debates between Taoists and Buddhists. And he got irritated. He picked up a statue of the Buddha and beat the Taoist representative to death. So he wasn't working out too well as the religious administrator. And his brother Mong Han had then moved Kublai Khan to take over those issues. But Arik Buk was real Mongol. He was out there on the horse all the time. He was erratic. He was like his father, who had a reputation as a very wild conqueror, actually. Sometimes the youngest son can turn out like that, and his father had been the youngest son. And so Arik Buk was taking over, and at this time, Kublai Khan was actually on the on the Yangtze River, because his brother Mong Han had assigned him. Mong Han died, and Kublai Khan thought, okay, I'll just continue to work. He told me what to do. But oddly, it's his wife. Her name was Chabi. Chabi, she sent coded messages to him. It's like, get yourself back here. Forget about the South Song. They're going to be there forever. We can conquer them later. Your brother is taking over Mongolia. The people are flocking to him. Come back. You should be the great Han. There's no indication that he had tremendous ambition before that. He had mostly tried to retreat from the battlefront. He would tell his older brother, oh, my gout is acting up. I got to go home for a couple months to kind of recover. And then he'd go home and lounge around and hunt a little bit maybe, which meant he would go out on the elephant. And then they would let the leopards and the eagles go catch the animals, and he had archers to shoot for him. He said, oh, shoot that one. And they would shoot. That's how he hunted. So we really don't have an indication. Maybe he did have ambition that I just can't see. I don't know. I have no true inside information. But Chabi, she seemed to really be very clear about what needed to be done. Focus on Arik Buk. He's your youngest brother. He is taking over. But Kublai had the greatest resource of all. He had northern China. Arik Buk had Mongolia. Well, there are not that many people in Mongolia, and they may love him very much, and they may own all the animals, but that's not really going to help you that much if you don't have enough food. And he did not. And his allies in Central Asia, what's now Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, all that area, they were allied with him. But when he then demanded all their food, they didn't want to give it up. And so his army was virtually starving. He surrendered to his brother, who had all the food of China and the huge, massive army of China, northern China. And Arik Buk surrendered in 1264 and disappeared from history. He, like many people, he died mysteriously.
Are you implying that there was foul play there, or it's just...
Yes, I think definitely there was. I think there was, but I don't want to point the finger exactly at Kublai Khan. Sometimes if people know the ruler needs something, they do it without being told to do it. So I cannot point the finger at him. Actually, Kublai Khan had organized an investigation and a trial of his brother. It never got to the point of trial, but the investigation had started. And so something was going on, and then he died.
So you've set up how Kublai ascended to the power that he amassed. How does he then manage to add all the additional territory to the Khan Empire?
One thing about Kublai Khan was that, okay, now he has a better understanding of how Chinese system works, of the Chinese bureaucracy, and of the advantages and disadvantages offered by China. He did not see a lot of advantage in Confucianism and all the rituals that went with it, other than maybe a certain amount of public relations. He could see that. But he saw the advantages of the technology that was there. And he also had, like his grandfather, he had a fairly good judgment for choosing very competent people. One of those was Aju, whom I mentioned, but Aju's father, Urihankadai, had been also very competent. Another great one who became the most famous of the general was named Bayan. And Bayan was a very sophisticated Mongol. He had lived in the Middle East with the Mongols ruling there. He lived in China. He had been around. He was at court a very exotic, handsome, exciting figure. And he gets most of the credit through Marco Polo and other people for the conquest of southern China. I certainly believe that he had a great, great role. There's no question. But Aju is overlooked because Aju was still pretty much Mongol. He was thinking in new ways, but he was out there. He was a little bit harsh with his soldiers. He wasn't as sort of nice and accommodating as Bayan was. And so Aju has been, to some extent, forgotten. But he was the one who organized that technological. He wasn't a technological person, but getting those personnel there to make the ships into offensive weapons that could be used to attack. And then he probably should have been in command of the entire army, but Kublai Khan placed Bayan, which was not a bad choice. And fortunately, those two men, very different in temperament, very different in many ways, but they cooperated. They seemed to like each other very much, or in the sense that I should say they respected each other very much. They realized that they each had different talents, and they worked together very well. They made an effective team. They just sort of worked their way down the Yangtze River, conquering one city after another until they finally reached the capital. And that was Kublai Khan still back there in Beijing, but he is organizing something that uses the best of the of all of his Muslim subjects and their skills. The Muslims were very good with numbers. You know, they knew about the zero, and they could do miracle things with numbers. Great for taxes for the Mongols, not so good for the Chinese people. You know, the Chinese were good with technology and production. So he had all these things, and he was, I don't want to say a genius, but he was skilled and good at organizing it.
But in contrast to his grandfather, who was a warrior first and a politician second, Kublai was more just a politician through and through and could manage all the people below him. That's rather how he ruled.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. It's almost insulting for any Mongol to be called a politician more than
a politician.
But it's probably fair to say, yes.
Yeah. Did Kublai himself see much sort of action in his life? You mentioned the story of how he would hunt, the fact that he was quite sickly, he couldn't really ride a horse. You know, did he ever, see much action?
No, he did. When his older brother was the Great Han and the conquest of Yunnan, he was very important. He went there, despite pleading gout. His brother said, okay, get the gout finished with and get back in the saddle and go back. Mm-hmm. So he did go back. And oddly, it was in a very clever move that he helped to negotiate. It wasn't the traditional Mongol way again, but the kingdom that was in Yunnan at that time, they felt fairly secure behind their river. They didn't think that the Mongols were going to be able to cross on goat skins. And they were just kind of they had this ad hoc army. They all gathered, the peasants put down their implements, and they came off and gathered. But it wasn't a real good army. But they didn't think the Mongols were going to be much of a danger because they couldn't get across the river. But in that case, he requisitioned rafts, and they made rafts. And sometimes if they would put a goat skin under the raft, it's kind of like pretending it's not really a wooden raft, it's a goat skin raft,
Yeah.
And so the Mongols felt more comfortable crossing the river on a goat skin. And so he was instrumental in that. He was.
Mm.
And then later, as I say, when Meng Khan died, Kublai Khan was down, and he negotiated a kind of a false victory at a battle where money was being exchanged back and forth. And so he had, and even late in life, he did go out in the campaign one time against his uncle in the north. So he did go out some, but mostly he was not on the forefront. He was not like Genghis Khan, his grandfather.
Those details about coaxing the warriors onto the wooden ships, by putting down the goat skins and so forth to make them feel more comfortable. I get the sense like it was as alien to the Mongol to be either parted from their horse or to cross the seas as it would be if we were to go to an uncontacted Amazon tribe and put them on an airplane and then fly them to another part of the world. It's almost inconceivable that one would do it. It's a form of magic and trickery in some sense.
They were very much dependent. None of the technology was Mongolian. None of it. They were mostly dependent on Chinese and to some extent Korean technology and craftsmen. But there again, there was a great advantage. Artisans, they have a reasonable position in Asian society at that time, but not a high position. They were not really very well respected. They were just workers. They weren't seen as anything special. The Mongols, however, from the time of Genghis Khan, they valued every artisan. If you could weave a rug, if you could make a pot, if you could write a page, translate, if you could work metal, anything you could do, the Mongols greatly respected it, and they respected them more than scholars, which in the Asian perspective overall is anathema. You spend your whole life respecting the scholars, the mandarins, and Confucian study and poetry and calligraphy. Mongols had no use for that, but they greatly valued the craftsmen, those artisans, and so many of them defected to the Mongols. Many of the Southern Song best craftsmen defected to the Mongols, and they knew they would get better treatment, they would be treated with more respect, and they would get higher rewards. So they were bringing in technology from other places, mostly, as I say, from southern China, but also from Korea.
Did Kublai continue Genghis's tradition of religious tolerance for all the subjects?
Yes, he did continue the tradition of religious tolerance. Even Genghis Khan had religious tolerance, which was absolute, but he also was able to use the conflict or the rivalry, I should say, among different religious groups to his own advantage.
Right.
And then Kublai Khan actually developed that aspect even more. He used the rivalry, especially in China, and it wasn't so much a religious ideological rivalry as a kind of a power and materialist rivalry among the different religions for how many monasteries they had and how much gold they had for their statues and all. And he was able to play off Taoists, Confucianists, Buddhists, and then he threw in, of course, Christians, Muslims, and even Manichaeans, and everything. So he was even better at playing off one again, but he did allow religious freedom, yes.
Jack, remind me the name of the Mongol queen. When the Khan Empire was at its most expansive, remind me of the Mongol queen who oversaw that, just her name.
Dorjin, which is
Dorjin. Okay.
E and D are the same in Mongolian, but usually we spell it Toregene, Dorjin. But she had been the wife of, she was chosen as the wife of Genghis Khan's son, Agudde. Genghis Khan chose her. He was very, very clever about choosing good wives for his sons, especially who had sometimes certain failures of their own. So he had chosen her. She was extremely smart, and she was already running the empire before her husband died. But then once he died, she became the official empress regent of the empire. And she ruled in a peaceful time. She stopped the conquest, which this machine had been going on. Now, after her came then her son, who was totally incompetent, named Gui Khan, and he tried to restart everything. And he only was in office 18 months, and he died mysteriously on the way to conquer Russia, or reconquer Russia. It was already under the control of his cousins. Oh, we don't know what he was doing. He was off to some bad task anyway, and he died. And then his wife took over Oklahamish, and unfortunately she was not like her mother-in-law. She was a sort of a greedy, narrow-minded woman who didn't have the expansive interest of Dorogen, her mother-in-law, who had a real set of ideas about the world and about the Mongol Empire and about peace, and especially supporting religions. She was very active in supporting every religion. So, unfortunately, with Oklahamish, she did not last very long in office either. And that's how the Princess Sortani, the mother of Kublai Khan, was able to have a little revolution and get her eldest son, Monghan, in office as the great Han and get rid of Ogede Han's descendants. But Dorogen was a great, great queen, a great empress of the largest empire in the world at the time.
It's funny, a perennial story when reading your books and then, absorbing the stories of all these various Mongol leaders and characters is that those who have more brains than glory, Genghis, Kublai, Dorogen, they do quite fine. But then those who just have glory seeping through their veins, the candle that burns bright, burns twice as bright, burns half as long. They live a big life, but it doesn't live throughout history the same ways. And I suppose that's also perennial, irrespective of the Mongols, just through history. Those with more brains than glory might end up. So Dorogen was in charge when the Khan Empire was at its most expansive. Could you just put on a map for us what regions they had dominion over?
And in her lifetime, they had all of northern China. They had most of what we called Russia today, and also Ukraine. They had almost all of the Middle East at that time, with the Persian world, and Central Asia, all the stands, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Azerbaijan. They had the Caucasus, yes, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Armenia. They also had armies that were operating in the area of Poland and Hungary and the Balkans, but those were never incorporated, we would say, into the empire, say the way Russia was, or the Ukraine and Russia were incorporated. Those areas were not, but the armies were certainly there. So the armies, at the time her husband died, the armies were fighting on the German border in Poland. They were fighting in what's now Czech Republic, in Hungary. In fact, they had reached the suburbs of Vienna, even. So that was extremely wide. And then they had reached the Indus River, in what's modern Pakistan, and some little groups had managed to cross the river, but the Mongols never had any success across the Indus River. There would be only raids that they could bring about, but they were not successful. So it was a huge, and Korea, of course, you had everything with Korea. And so it was a huge empire. I mean, you think about, no one else in the world has ever ruled China and Russia. It's never happened. And then you throw in Iran, Afghanistan. I mean, these are places that the world gets bogged down today in wars and cannot conquer. But the Mongols had conquered it all.
Didn't Genghis take Afghanistan in less than a year? And he absolutely loved it. It was one of his favorite places in the world.
Yes, it was one of his favorite places that he had conquered because he liked the environment. He took it very quickly, but it was also the place of his greatest sadness and of some of the greatest destruction, because his favorite grandson, was killed there in the
Skill
Battle
battle.
of Bamia, yes. And that resulted in tremendous loss of life for everyone concerned with that. He had never lost anyone. His sons were all alive. All of his grandsons were alive. And for him to lose the one grandson whom he loved the most,
Mm.
that was a very difficult time for him in Afghanistan. But yes, he had loved it very much.
Did you ever read Rory Stewart's In Between the Places?
No, I did not. No.
I think you'd love it. It was early 2000s, and Rory Stewart is a politician these days, but back then he did a 2 or 3 week walk across Afghanistan, and it was a week after 9/11. So it was maybe 2 or 3 month walk, but it's just amazing, and you see little historical anecdotes as he's walking through of the Khans would have swept right through this valley here that I'm walking by, and under the great, something that stands out to me as well from the Genghis Khan making the modern world is, for instance, what we can only imagine what Genghis would have thought of the Buddhas of Bamiyan, these three huge structures that were clearly ancient, well before Genghis. And so these nomadic horsemen are now really discovering that this you cannot even start to understand actually what is this world that we're inhabiting, and how many people have been here before us, trying to make sense of themselves throughout history.
It's interesting that also with Afghanistan, it wasn't just, I think, the beauty of the country and all and the history, but it came later in his career. This is towards the end of the conquest for him. He's conquered most of what he can do. He's starting to get more reflective about life and about religion, about all the succession, how's the empire going to go on without me? So he was thinking about a lot of things in Afghanistan. And there was a lot of inspiration, I think, as you said, point out, probably for like such as Buddhas of Bamiyan, but also the mountains themselves, and the many scholars that he called from China and from the Muslim world to meet with him and to discuss all the issues of life. So Afghanistan was a place for him, but an important phase in his own mental, spiritual, emotional development as he prepared for the end.
And we started off by calling back to the fact that you had this entire second life, after you turned 50, the Berlin Wall falls, the Soviet Union collapses, you fly over, you trace the Silk Route, and you enter into this historical investigation of the Mongols. But just one of the biggest details that's slept on about Genghis is that he didn't leave Mongolia until he was in his 50s himself. The real hard part of his life was unifying all of these disparate nomadic tribes. And I actually think that's, it's very inspiring for myself or a lot of other people. It's like, it doesn't matter what you've done up until now. There's always going to be time to do great things. Genghis didn't make these conquests until he was in his 50s.
Yes, that's right. He began these raids, we would say, in China, not really a campaign, but just the border raids after 1209. And so he's already fought these long wars just to unite the Mongols. Only 1 million Mongols. Only 1 million.
Yeah.
It took 3 decades to get them united under one government. Well, once he did that, then conquering the world was kind of easy. And he said, and then actually his world conquest then did not last very long. The world conquest part was less than 20 years.
So why is Torogen not recognized as one of history's great rulers? Because I wrote into ChatGPT, who ruled over the most territory in history? And the results was Napoleon, Alexander the Great, the British Empire, and Genghis Khan. And I thought, but here is this woman who ruled over more land than all these people ever did. How do you explain that?
I hate to retreat to any kind of any sexist explanation right away. However, in the case, I think, of the scholars around them who were mostly recording the history of the Mongols, because the Mongols were very secretive. They didn't want their history out too much. But it would be Chinese scholars and Muslim scholars. For the most part, neither one really were very respectful of women as rulers. They had a great prejudice against it. They were very patrilineal societies, patriarchal societies, and they had a tremendous bias against it. Having said that, I will say that still the very best information that we have comes from Persian chroniclers who were more complimentary towards her and were somewhat accepting of the fact that she was a woman, and they could see that what she had done in the same way that they could respect the mother of Kublai Khan, Sortani. Then they heaped a lot of their criticism on the one in the middle. I'd mentioned that Hamish, who wasn't so quite so clever. Also, the early Christian envoys who came in, they were also somewhat taken with the power of Thorogen and wrote about it. They were quite surprised about it, but they were not critical because she was technically Christian, but it's a different kind of Christian. It's a tribal Christian. They didn't use wine, and they didn't have statues, and they didn't have many of the things that we think of as essential to Christianity, but they were kind of Christian. And so I think the Christian envoys, they had hoped that she'd become a real Christian, swear allegiance to the Pope and all. And that just did not happen. But for the most part, they were dismissive of her role. And after all, to them, it's like, she's not conquering anything. She's just back there ruling the empire, And that's what Mongol women have been doing, administering things and managing finances and managing territory. They've been administering a lot of stuff for a long time. That was not new. It's the conquest that's happening. And during her reign, it stopped. There were a few battles here and there because something was happening, but there were no major campaigns of conquest under her. So what's there to write about? She was just ruling over the empire. So that's sort of how they saw it at the time.
Right,
and
right.
They were, and some of the religious people were complimentary towards her because of her support of their religious foundations, Taoists and also Buddhists and Muslims as well. They were all recipients of her generosity. But those are just little tiny things. It doesn't add up onto a big picture of a great ruler. But I do believe she was a great ruler. I respect her very much. And like so many of us, and like Genghis Khan himself, our greatest failing sometimes, though, is with our own children, that we end up supporting them too much. And she wanted her son to take over, and he was his own father called him a rotten egg. He was just not good, but she wanted her sons to take over.
It's almost an impossible standard to live up to, though. By definition, you have to be great and exceptional to either accrue that wealth and power, but then administer that wealth and power. And only so much can be taught, right? There is still a nature born into every single person that comes out of a mother's womb. And as much as you try, it might not, I mean, that's something we don't have to talk about, but the question of nature versus nurture, I find like endlessly fascinating. Obviously nurture is involved, but I think nature probably wins out at the end of the day.
And it always puzzled me of this woman who is so well informed about religious differences and administering the empire and economics. She was very good with running the finances of the country. She was so good with this. Why did she choose that loser of a son to take over? She did have her husband had actually preferred another son, and I'm not sure that his choice was any better, to be honest, but he was just a loser.
All right, Jack, let's turn to Kublai in Japan, because just cinematically, it makes for one of the great confrontations of history. These Mongols are the undisputed greatest warriors on the mainland. The samurai are famously, incredible warriors with an entire philosophy underpinning them. So it was weather that kind of stopped a proper engagement with the Japanese, as you write about in the book. But can you talk just a little bit about the few interactions they did manage to have, how the balance, the scales ended up balancing when it came to warrior versus warrior?
Yes, there wasn't much to report in the first invasion of 1274. That was a reasonably smaller invasion, and there wasn't a lot of that happened. The Mongols just kind of simply failed. And again, part of the problem was they had developed this strategy of attacking the cities along the rivers of China, but the cities of Japan weren't exactly right there within firing distance of the Mongol ships, and there were all these differences. So that one, no. But then later, when they came back in 1281, they came back after they had defeated the Southern Song. And so then, first of all, it's a question of why is Kublai Khan returning? Most people just consider pride. He wanted to conquer them, and pride is always a factor. But this was a massive invasion, and I think it's quite clear to me that his main objective was he had this huge Southern Song army he had conquered. Genghis Khan's approach to a conquered army was they lost the war, they're not going to be any good to me, and they were killed. That's just the way But Kublai Khan was different. He did not want to do that. He was the new enlightened kind of, we're not going to kill them all. But he had to do something with it. What are you going to do with? You have hundreds of thousands of men down there who are in a defeated army, and you really can't trust them. So he was finding places. He'd explored Tibet. He sent an expedition. They already controlled Tibet, but he sent an expedition to find out sort of what can you do with soldiers there, up the Amur River into Siberia, and to Sakhalin Island. And I think that Japan was very clearly a part of that, because now in the modern archaeology that's been done underwater, most of the ships didn't have many weapons, and they were just loaded with agricultural implements. So he seemed to be wanting to set up a prison colony or a military prison colony. I think that was his objective. So it wasn't a heavily armed fleet. And there was another problem. Mongols always fought with what they called left wing, right wing. And then the command center was in the middle, and the center, gold, they called it gold. And so they had left and right. So they organized the Navy like that as well. But they organized it with half of it being built in Korea and then commanded from there, and half of it being built from southern China and being built from there. Well, unfortunately, it's not like the Mongols, who are all out there speaking the same language, and left and right cavalry. They coordinate, they see each other and all like that. No, you've got two fleets coming, and it's not clear who's in command. There is no central fleet. It's just two fleets. So it was disorganized to start with. And there was as much competition between what we could call the Korean fleet and the South Chinese fleet as there was against the Japanese. They already started off in a bad way. But then you get to the land, and once again, the Mongol strategy is not going to work. They have now gunpowder. They have these exploding grenades, we can call them, these sort of cannonball-looking things that you can throw or you can hurl with a catapult and all. But it doesn't do much damage on the beach. If you're not hitting a wall, so they're bombing the beach, and it scares the animals, yes. And the samurai warriors are not used to this. The samurai warriors, they come together, and it's a very ceremonial sort of meeting. The samurai, they first, they recite their genealogy to each other, and they go through all this. Well, the Mongols here, they just come up in ships, and they start throwing grenades that are exploding. And, of course, it's scaring the heck out of the horses, not to mention the men, but it's not really doing a lot of damage. And the ships are already having trouble coordinating, and then we usually credit the defeat of the Mongols with the kamikaze, the wind that came in, the typhoon. That is certainly the final blow. But I do believe that the Japanese deserve more credit for the defeat of the Mongols than they are given, because they also developed some very clever strategies, which was bring the army down at night. The Mongols are all out there in the ships. They can't see what's going on. And then you start firing flaming arrows at them at night. Well, they can see that flaming arrow coming, but they have difficulty locating the source, and they certainly can't respond to it. They can't send a bunch of horsemen in there at night suddenly. So the Japanese were really quite clever, I think, in the way that they approached the Mongols. And so they were already setting ships on fire. Ships were adrift out there in the water. Things were happening. And then the typhoon came, and the Mongol ships were scattered. And then that became really the end of the whole expedition. It was a huge loss of life. But cruel irony of it, just remember in the first invasion, Kublai Khan lost, but his goal really was to stop the trade. And he did. He controlled it ever after.
By capturing Dong.
Yes, and or no, just by breaking the supply lines from China. To China from Japan, and then capturing the Song. But then the second invasion, his big objective is what to do with all of these soldiers. And that's solved. They drowned. But it's not his fault. He didn't kill them. But a large part of the problem is solved. Not completely. He still has a lot of soldiers on land, and he sets up these kind of agricultural colonies in what we call Siberia, up on the Amur River, and also in Tibet.
But in this fleet of hundreds of ships, there was never an instance where a few of them managed to actually break ground and there was hand-to-hand combat between the Mongols and the Japanese.
No, there was combat on land with the Japanese along the beach. The Mongols never quite made it to fighting against the cities, but on the beach, yes.
Do we know if they fared against the samurai?
Okay, they have. Yes, we know in an odd way, because the Japanese bureaucrats, they gave out pensions later to the people. And so all the people had to write up long, detailed explanations of what they had done.
Oh, that's amazing.
And very often they painted scrolls of what they had done. And in fact, that's the very first image we ever have of an exploding bomb is in one of those Japanese scrolls. And the horse reacting to it. In fact, the horse was wounded in a particular image. So we have the image of that. But and also they show us very clearly that the Mongols were mostly sending in infantry of different ethnic groups under their control. So you can see Korean soldiers there. You can see other ethnic groups. And then the Mongols were at this point, the Mongol horseback cavalry Mongols were more or less like officers sort of in charge of things. So it's a much different kind of war. And they are not there to fight the samurai on horseback the same way that the samurai had been fighting one another with all of their equipment and their swords and things. No, the soldiers were there just to fight. And they simply were attacking. So all the kind of old etiquette of the samurai was violated, but it wasn't very effective. Even if they were winning a skirmish here or there, they weren't making any progress. And then they would retreat back to the ships after a little battle. They simply were not making good progress.
And I suppose the superiority of their horse skills is maybe mitigated by this new terrain.
Yes. Yeah, fighting on a beach is not ideal for the horse.
You've now written 3 books on the history of the Mongolians, mostly the Khans. What are the most significant unanswered questions in Mongol history?
Okay, now, Ryan, I have to stop and think a moment about that. Yeah. Unanswered questions. I think in a certain way, I could tell the story, but I couldn't answer the real questions that we have about the Mongols and what truly motivated some of the people, including Genghis Khan himself. And I can say a lot of things about it, and there's this evidence, there's that evidence, and I believe this a little bit and that a little bit. But ultimately, I cannot answer that question of what made him so successful. And other people, they want to say, oh, it was the horse. Oh, it was the Parthian shot of the way they shoot, attacking it. They can shoot while retreating. Oh, it was the tactic of the feigned retreat that you mentioned. All of these things were known. There was nothing new there. Or they say the organization of his army, squads of 10 into companies of 100, into battalions of 1,000 and all. All of that other people had too. So there was nothing new about that. He didn't invent new technology, nothing. But somehow he conquered the largest empire of any person in the world. So the final question, I can't really answer. I can just describe things happening, but why did he do that?
Mm.
You know, and there's sort of the spiritual answers about, you know, the power of God, the power of his charisma or his genius, or things, and yet in the end, I don't know. And I would say the same for Kublai Khan. I can say what Marco Polo thought, other people said and thought. I can have my own ideas. But how did this somewhat nerdy, overweight Mongol boy unite all of China?
Yeah.
And today, China is pretty much what he united. In fact, it's a little bit, he united a bigger China than is there now. But northern China, southern China, western China, Tibet, he united all of that. You think, how? Why? And I tell the story about Chabi and her influence, but I can only tell the story. I can't really prove anything. What was there this burning ambition when he was back there studying all this Buddhist and Taoist literature? Was there a burning ambition to conquer? Just because we don't see it doesn't mean it's not there.
Yeah.
So these questions, I'm not sure they can be answered, and I certainly have not answered them. But what I would like to see more attention to that we could, I think, understand better is, what do they have to teach us today about the world? What can we learn from the Mongols that's different, you know? And I think there are lessons that we can learn from Genghis Khan. I think he was very advanced, and that's when I talk about the making of the modern world. He was very much a modern person in many ways, with his ideas about religious freedom, ending the sale of women, the kidnapping of women, protection of all diplomats, all envoys. There were many things about his thinking that were very modern, and we still haven't achieved them. You know, we still have not to this day. And so I think that's a remarkable, and I do think, so we can learn from him, even without understanding everything perfectly. We can learn from him, and I think he has many lessons to teach us.
The main lesson that stands out to me from your books has been the lesson of meritocracy, or rather the promotion of meritocracy throughout wherever they went. Because it was before and since not always been practiced with total unambiguity. There's maybe like, you know, who is your family? Where did you come from? What is your religion? Those maybe have been metrics that got you promoted rather than the simple merit. How good are you at leading people, at shooting an arrow, at organizing cattle, at cooking, etc.? It seems like deep a part of the Mongolians is this respect and acknowledgement of merit.
Yes, and I would say for Genghis Khan in particular, that was absolutely true. He had a genius for picking out people who had very good skills and who were extremely loyal to him. And I'd mentioned that he would kill most of the enemy soldiers who lost against him. It was not also always true that in one well-known case, someone actually shot the horse out, and it was a horse that he liked very much, shot the horse out from under him and killed him, and killed the horse. And Genghis Khan was so impressed, he had the guy brought there, or he had a whole bunch, he didn't know who had done it, he had them all brought. and he demanded to know who had done it. And the man, he didn't want his other comrades to suffer, and so he stepped forward and he said that he did it, thinking he was about to be killed right away. And then Genghis Khan said, "Okay, I changed your name, and now you're a Mongol."
And he became one of the greatest generals in his army.
He did, yes. He became a great general. So he picked them out. He was very good with that, and he was good at picking out what are the skills that people have, like seeing that the Arabs, wow, what they can do with those numbers. And I don't know that he understood about the zero and the algorithms that they were using at that time. And of course, algorithm is a word from the area he conquered, algorithm. He conquered algorithm. So they were using algorithms at that time, and he didn't need to understand that, but he saw the value of what they were doing. He had a skill. They had a skill he didn't have. His people rode horses and shot arrows. They could do numbers. Okay, you bring that in. These other people, okay, they can make things that can be sold back and forth. We keep them. We use. He had a great skill for that. But, as we had just mentioned, that all this tremendous emphasis on merit. But in the end, he turns it over to his son.
Right, yeah.
And
so it wasn't consistent on it through to the end.
Yes, and I think any of us can understand how that happens, that you love your children and all, but an unfortunate thing for him, or a little tragedy, I think, in his emotion at the end, was actually the son that he wanted to inherit. His eldest son, the other sons refused to recognize him as their brother. And there's a famous scene that was called when he called his sons together to discuss the succession. And the oldest boy had been born at the end of his wife's kidnapping. His wife, Bertha, had been kidnapped and married to another man of the Merghouza tribe. And then when she came back, she was pregnant. And he accepted, this is my son. It's my wife's child. This is my son. And then, so when he called all the sons together at the end to talk about the succession, he said, okay, I want to hear your thoughts. At first, I want to hear from Zuch, that's the oldest boy. Oldest man. I want to hear from him. And that's normal in Mongolia, you call by age. And he was the oldest. But immediately the second one, Sagade, he jumped up. And he said, why do you call him? He's just a Merghouza bastard. And you're going to call him, that means you want him to become the great Khan. You can imagine the greatest conqueror in the world. He's sitting there, and here his son starting to fight in front of him. And his own son, Sakate, is arguing with him. And it was a very impassioned moment. And Genghis Khan defended their mother. He said, you are not there. You do not know who loved who and who did not love who. The sky was turning, the stars were turning in the sky, the earth was turning around. You do not know what was happening. You cannot say it. If I say he is my son, who are you to say he is not my son? And Sagade said, we accept you, you are our father, but a deer shot with words cannot be loaded on a horse. A deer shot with words cannot be eaten. We accept your word. And Genghis Khan knew. But then he wouldn't let that son become either. So they chose a good Han. He was the most good-natured. He drank the most. Everybody liked him. He was generous to everybody. And so the third son became the great Han after him. So, yes, he was merit, my son.
So the question of why Jack we can only speculate, of course, but couldn't it just be as simple as if someone has significant enough ambition and an appetite for really big risk, that it's simply just because it can be done and it's there to be done, that they go ahead and do it. Why did Napoleon decide to do what he did? Why does Elon Musk decide to do what he does? Just simply, it's available to me, I can do it, and I'm prepared to take the insane risk to try for it. And if it turns out in my favor, then history will remember me. Could it just be something as simple as that, rather than a deep sort of spiritual ambition or spiritual manifestation that Genghis had? Rather, it's just simply, I can do it, I want to do it, I'm going to try and do it.
I think that's true at a small level, in that it was incremental, or I should say an incremental level. It's not that he thought about the whole world at first, but I think at first he thought, okay, we could go raid those people, we can get some stuff, and then it's got, okay, we can raid some other people, and then, we've got all this territory, what are we going to do with this, It's just not raiding now, they're giving us every year, we have tribute coming, and then he would conquer that. So I think in an incremental way, it was just like, it's there, let's go for it and do it. And then later in life, I think he did have the kind of vision that you're talking about. He got to the point that he envisioned conquering the whole world. It was very much in his mind. But it started off, I do believe, as small raids.
There's a really, really nice line that you used a few times in Emperor of the Seas. I'm not sure if you used it in Making of the Modern World as well, but it's that history often hinges on the smallest of things.
Oh, yeah. I think that's in this case, I believe, if I remember correctly, I was actually talking about the Chinese ability to manufacture nails, that we think about their great ships that they had, and that they had all kinds of bulkheads inside and massive sails and compass and all like that. And those are all important pieces, but none of it would have been possible without the ability of China to produce massive amounts of very strong iron nails, which no other society could do. Iron was very rare in the world, and people were not going to be wasting iron on a ship. In fact, when Marco Polo and his uncles had first arrived in Hormuz, when Marco Polo was a kid, only 17 or so, all the ships there were sewn together with rope made from coconut husk. That was because there was no iron, but China was producing nails. And that was the key, I think, to the Southern Song Great Wall of the Sea, was their ability to make nails. Because ships have been around for a while. But so it's these little details sometimes like that it's easy to overlook. It's not exciting like a ship and a navy and a battle at all. But but Shakespeare had a much similar idea, of course, with, for want of a nail, the shoe was lost. For want of a shoe, the horse was lost. For want of a horse, the kingdom was lost.
Yeah, so seemingly small but insanely consequential details are,
Yes.
Kind of the magic of reading a history book or something that you've written like that. Because we maybe have the sense that a lot of it is deterministic. Obviously, it was going to go that way.
Yeah.
All the pieces were in place. But rather, what are the insane moments of serendipity that we don't know about? How many great warriors just died because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time by a stray arrow, who could have gone to be 2x, 3x Genghis? We don't know.
There's so many small things, and I do like those small details. It's like this, looking at the role of wooden carts, wooden boats, and the fact that, in a certain way, when the Mongols lost the first invasion of Vietnam, it was based on that small detail of not destroying the boats. They won the battle. They defeated the Vietnamese. They lost the war. They were not the first, and they were not the last to win the battles in Vietnam and lose the war.
And they made it to Indonesia, Jack. Imagine if they had succeeded in Indonesia and then just continued their territorial ambition, taken those boats to the southern islands, and then come over to Australia. I could be Mongolian right now.
Okay, that's a good... No, the invasion of Java, in particular, it was actually a rather small one in a way, and came at the very end of life for Kublai Khan. He had already launched his first great fleet of commercial ships to go to Persia. And There are all these different versions. I mean, the official Chinese version was that the Javanese had killed some of his envoys and they had branded one of them and chopped off some ears and sent him back maimed and all. And Kublai Khan wanted to avenge him. And then if you look at the Javanese oral record, their oral stories, it was a love story that Kublai Khan wanted a wife. Well, at this point in life, he's 70-some years old. He's not out looking for a new wife from Java. But the Javanese version, of course, is he wanted a Javanese wife and he had a princess in mind and he wanted her. So you have these versions, but my version is kind of simple. He had already launched this first great expedition from southern China to the Persian Gulf, to Hormuz. But the only possible danger along the way at this point would have been from Java. And I think he wanted to neutralize the power of that. And to a certain extent, I would say he succeeded in that. That Java never interfered with the Mongol or the Chinese, whichever we want to call it at that point, the Mongol-Chinese explorations and expeditions to the Middle East. And they actually had ties all the way to Mogadishu at that point. And I think he was trying to neutralize Java, and he did not conquer it, but he did neutralize it.
All right, Jack. So you've again been super generous with your time. Got just a few more questions for you if you've still got the energy for them.
All right, come on. It's always interesting to talk to you. And this is my life. My family's decided to hear these stories. You're willing to listen to me. We go to dinner with the family and they put a muzzle on me. I'm not allowed to talk about anything that happened before last year.
No. Well, look, I think it's maybe 4 times now I've returned to certain chapters of Making of the Modern World. I find when, I've got no sort of podcast to prepare for or nothing that's particularly intriguing me that I want to listen to, I can just kind of reliably return to usually the first chapter when Genghis is actually organizing the steppe, consolidating the tribes. I don't know, there's something really sort of magical and peaceful and interesting about it. So, I consider it an immense privilege to have your time. So if any of it you're willing to give me, I'm very, very grateful.
Thank you.
Many of the chapters start with a Mongolian proverb. Which are those that stand out to you most? Which ones are most pithy that just live in the back of your mind all the time?
Well, one of them that I quote to my grandchildren too much. They're tired of hearing that. If you are afraid, don't do it. If you do it, don't be afraid. That was very important, I think. Yeah. And I still think about it. Because oftentimes, I don't know if I want to do that. So I say to myself, okay, if you're afraid, don't do it. If you do it, don't be afraid. Just do it or don't do it, And I think that's a good one. I think one of the important ones that came from Genghis Khan was, and I've forgotten now exactly how I translated it into English precisely, but he recognized early on that the problem with conquering a people is if their leaders lived on, they would cause more trouble. And as soon as you're gone, especially a small army like the Mongols are gone, they're going to revolt So he would say, pursue them and kill them until they are no more. And that's why he would wipe out the army and all the ruling class of any people that he conquered. So I think for him, that was a very important rule. Kublai Khan changed that. He did not follow that rule anymore. When he conquered the southern Song, he took the Dowager Empress and the child emperor, and he took them to Beijing, gave them a palace, each their own palace, gave them a new title, and so on. He was being very generous, and as I mentioned before with the Song soldiers, he tried to redistribute them to other places. He didn't want to incorporate too many into his own army. He did not trust them for the most part. But So he changed that, but that was very important, I think, principle for him.
Mm. What one more that you might have that just sticks out?
Another one that I'm not sure where it comes from. It
Mm-hmm.
really could be more Chinese because I have the feeling it's more Chinese. But the frog at the bottom of a well never understands the sea. There are many versions of that kind of, or you could say,
Yeah, yeah,
the frog in a small pond never understands the sea. And
yeah. You don't know what you don't
I
know.
think that's important for all of us. We all live in our own small world. We live in our
Yeah,
pond.
yeah,
We live in our little well or whatever. And it's very hard to comprehend the larger world. And of course, for Mongols, when they say sea, they mean the whole world. We think of the world as land. The Mongols always thought of the world as the sea. They always called it the sea, the world. And I think that's a very interesting idea.
yeah. It's a great one. I love how pithy they are because we kind of
Yeah.
instinctually know these things. But when
Yes.
it's delivered to you in sort of poetic prose like that, it does sort of hit home. Yeah, because absolutely, like even with a very sincere and earnest investigation into something, you have barely shone light on a grain of sand on the beach
Yes.
for what it actually is and actually making sense of it. I think it drives a deep amount of sort of empathy at the end of the day. Like if you cast your eye to any of the major conflicts around the world at the moment, or the major issues, um,
Yes.
turns out it's way more complex than one article can necessarily surmise. Uh, so this was a detail that really stood out to me from Emperor of the Seas because the Mongols have this spiritual reverence for the land. You can't put water to extinguish a fire. And we spoke about it in our last conversation, the sort of um, modern political stain that mining has within Mongolia, because it's this landlocked country. There aren't many economic opportunities, but it's very mineral rich. But spiritually, they just don't want to stain or harm the land. But Kublai built more than 17,000 boats. Now, this is deforestation at an incredible
Yeah.
scale. How did he justify that? And then how did the Mongols how did that sit with them?
I don't think he ever thought about it in those terms at all. But it's true, there was very heavy deforestation in China with the construction of these ships. They also recycled old ships, but that often made it even worse because they became worse ships.
Mm.
And the deforestation, unfortunately, wasn't even particularly effective in the sense that often the warships were being built so quickly, and with some recycled parts, some new parts, and all, they were not very effective. But I don't think Kublai Khan thought about that.
Mm. Are you more or less bullish on Mongolia than you were when we spoke 3 years ago?
No, I feel good about Mongolia. They really are in a rough neighborhood when you look at what's going on around them. You have China and Russia, or not too far away is North Korea, and Mongolia is able to maintain good relations with all of those people, as well as the others such as South Korea, Japan, the United States. I would say Mongolia basically has a good relationship with every country in the world. They try very hard. They participate in every peacekeeping mission of the United Nations to be helpful. They really are struggling, and they are it's a big country in a way, but it's sort of a small island of democracy and freedom in the central heart of Asia. I I greatly respect them today, and I don't know how they're able to keep it up when much richer countries around them, sometimes in Central Asia and in that area, are not able to do it.
Mm. Do you still keep your place in the countryside there?
Yes.
When are you going to return?
Uh, well, now, it's hard for me to go there in the winter now. Not, I love it in the winter. I really do love it. But the people are so responsible for me, and they're very worried. I don't, my wife is gone. My children are all wherever in the world all the time, doing other things, grandchildren. And people feel very responsible for me. And you're in a very cold place. And if the fire goes out or the hot water stops or the pipe freeze, or if I fall on the ice, they worry. I feel like, okay, I'm okay. I'll make,
Yeah.
I'll do something. But people worry so much about me. So I mostly have to go now in the more pleasant seasons, which are beautiful, absolutely beautiful. But the winter in Mongolia is an experience unlike any I've had anywhere else in the world. And I love Mongolia in every season, which means basically winter and the middle of July.
Do you still jump on?
Two seasons.
Do you still jump on a horse when you go back?
I have not in about 2 or maybe 3 years, I think, maybe been back on a horse or camel, either one. But time just goes on, and things change in your life. And, people panic if I don't drive a car anymore, since I turned 70. Hey, they're right. They're right. And I gave it up voluntarily. And it's the same with a horse. It's like, oh my God, can he get up? Or can he get down? What were you going to do? So I try not to scare people too much, even when I think, oh yeah, I can do that. I could do that. But maybe they're right.
You'll be right, Jack. What they don't know won't hurt them.
Yes.
How much romanticization do you still cast back to the memories of you flying into this, post-Soviet Union series of countries and just the wonderful immersion you had into this world?
With all memories, in life, they become more dramatic or more beautiful or more horrible, or, the emotional part becomes exaggerated. But I really remember very distinctly some of these feelings from my first encounter with Mongolia, because it was such a different world and it was so strong. And so the impressions there are very, very strong. There were other things like, maybe I was very tired, the car was bumpy and things like that. I've forgotten about some of that.
Get that, yeah.
I shouldn't say car. Back then we didn't even have cars, but, there were these vans and Jeeps and things. But anyway, yeah. Yes, but it's also okay. I feel like everything I write, I do believe I'm trying to be honest about it. But it's like the old grandfather talking about the childhood and, and back then everything was good and wonderful and peaceful, but you had to walk uphill through the snow to school and home and back both ways uphill, or, it gets kind of, yeah, okay, maybe I go off this way and that way. But part of it also to write, I think as a writer, I want to be honest with people about my feelings as well as about the facts of what I find. I don't want to pretend, I'm coming in here as a great judge. It's just like God looking at the world and judging No, I'm a person. I'm coming in here. I like this. I don't like that. This tastes good. That's kind of strange. I want people to know that this is honestly what I think. Everything that I write is honestly what I think. But also I am a human being who has feelings. And this is what I feel. So you can discount that if you want, or you can add it to it. But I want to be honest about my feelings as well as about my thoughts in my head.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's obvious in the books that I love Mongolia. I love Mongolian history. I respect Genghis Khan. Kublai Khan, I'm more mixed on. I respect him a lot. I don't have as much kind of personal identification. He did grow up as a prince. It's kind of hard to identify with the life of a prince, with the boy struggling out in the countryside, falling in love with the first time and chasing a lost horse and things like that. It's easier to respond to those stories as a human.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm honest with people about my emotion, but I love Mongolia. I love the history, and I respect even when I don't love every single ruler. Well, no, not everyone that I respect. That's not true, but it's clear when I respect them or don't. It's clear.
Yeah.
I want to be honest.
So, Making of the Modern World was your fourth book, I think.
Probably.
But you wrote so many books, about the Native Americans, about the history of money, and then you entered into this series of Mongolian books.
Yeah.
But Making the Modern World was such an outlier of success, right? It sold hundreds of thousands of copies. Elon Musk is routinely tweeting about how it's, one of a series of 10 books that, he thinks everyone should read. So it's crazy. like, what type of serendipity has come into your life because of the outrageous success of that book?
Well, you just mentioned one. I mean, Elon Musk, uh, and I've been very surprised by much of that. I wanted to write a book, obviously, and I enjoyed writing it very much. I did not anticipate the kind of reaction that it created, and I have been truly, truly blessed with that. That some people whom I respect enormously have said kind things about my work, and I'm so surprised about it, to be honest, for the most part. But I guess the most gratifying part is the international part, that it's in more than, I can't exactly say, but I think more than 33 languages, if I'm not mistaken. Uh, Even when it's a small language and there's no royalties involved or something, I'm deeply honored by that. And I'm so fascinated. Why would they be interested in that book? But the greatest honor of all is from the people of Mongolia.
Yeah.
The people of Mongolia, that they have embraced me far beyond anything that I deserve. I mean, and that's not just humility, that's honesty.
Right.
I was writing a book. I tried to do the best job I could, and they have been, through the decades now, it's 2 decades, they have been so kind to me, so supportive to me. I can never thank them enough for what they have given me in my life. It's much greater than I gave them.
Well, you were recognized with the highest award that a non-Mongolian could receive, the Order of the Polar Star. In all humility of what you just said, you have propelled whatever Mongolia's cultural and soft power is internationally so much further. And so you have done quite a lot for them.
Well, they were cut off from much of their history in the 20th century. And the socialist era was a difficult era. The Stalin era was difficult. There were many achievements made in Mongolia. I don't condemn that era, but there was much done to wipe out their history. And so if I could just stimulate more interest in Mongolian scholars and other scholars, and now I'm beginning to see, I think, new generation coming along, and I really like that a lot, of new scholars. And even if they decide I'm all wrong and disagree with me, I'm happy to stimulate that kind of reaction, whether it's against me or with me or something else, or just a totally different view. That part I'm happy about. It's like a parent who sees the child grow up. The students came along, and now we have a whole new generation of students who are doing a great job. Mongolians are very international people. They're very good with language. They're very good with other ways of thinking. And I think that the intellectual power of Mongolia is going to be very great in this century. They're going to have a greater intellectual contribution to the world. And I hope for that. I really hope for that.
Fuck yeah, Jack. I completely echo all of that. Is there anything that we didn't talk about today that you wanted to say or hoping to talk about?
Well, I figured I end on an odd note. We talk about this negative image about the Mongols, but I end this new book on the Emperor of the Seas in a strange place, and that is with a play by Eugene O'Neill, who was an American playwright, 20th century, and it was produced at Broadway actually as a comedy, although he didn't write it quite that way. He wrote it a little bit farcical, called Marco Millions. And but then he later published the original version because he was so upset about the way the Broadway producers and backers and investors had put together his play and made it. But he wrote this outstanding work, and he showed that moment when Marco Polo arrived in China, it really was a great moment in history that Marco Polo, it was a pre-capitalist era, but it was still a very materialist expedition, of course. He was coming to China to make a profit. And he meets Kublai Khan. And by him, I mean also the whole Chinese world, a whole different. He encounters something. That was really the first encounter. The civilizations had contact before, but Eugene O'Neill narrowed in on this encounter of two men as a way of countering two great civilizations in history that had come on different paths and were headed on different paths. And the West was headed towards capitalism and that mercantile world. And Kublai Khan was still struggling with a lot of religious ideas and different things. And he says of Marco Polo, he's seen everything and learned nothing. And it struck me because Marco Polo and his father and uncle, they returned to Europe on that very first Chinese convoy that was sent from China, and a Chinese princess named He. She was the leading aristocrat on there to go marry the Il Khan, the Mongol ruler of Iran. And she's there with her pet tiger and all kinds of strange things and all. But this coming together of those two worlds, and they both went in different directions. And I feel like now, today, we are at that point again. The East and the West, we can simplify it down to this kind of what we think of as the modern mentality of the world, which maybe is not so modern. But are we going to see the world and learn nothing? Or is there really something that we can see? And in that play, oddly, Bayan, the great general, Bayan wants to go conquer Europe. And Kublai Khan says, why would we conquer those people? You conquer people and you become like them. And he saw the difference between the West and the East, in the play at least. And I think today we are at a similar place. We have a choice of going in different directions or trying to understand each other. And I don't want to say one is right, one is wrong, but we seem to be headed in a bad direction. And I would hope that we can learn something from this past era to both to do the positive things that they do, but to avoid the mistakes that they made. And I respect Eugene O'Neill, as a 20th century writer, so much for his vision. And I hope that we're going to have a better outcome this time. I can't say that's what I believe, but that's what I hope for between, say, East and West, or just narrow it down to the United States and China. I mean, those two, they seem to epitomize the issues. We need to move together forward. Why divide the world again?
Well, Jack, once again, it's an incredible privilege to get to speak with you in this sort of formality. And I am really excited to see how it turns out with Lex. I think you're going to have a great time. And it's going to obviously do wonders for your work as well.
Well, you've helped me prepare me for that. So thank you.
We'll see.
You're the warm-up act.
All the best, mate.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ryan.